Hello everyone, my name is Morgan. I'm a student of economics and business economics, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit about economic methodology. So, to keep it short, I will tell you a small part of what you're going to be learning. As a bird's eye view, the course is divided into two parts. What I call prescriptive theories, which talk about how you should do science and economics. So this we could call logical positivists to Merton and Popper and cum-laude later in the book, and descriptive theories, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. They're going to be throwing a lot of names at you in this part of the course, which can be confusing, so that's why we made this video. So hopefully we can make it a little bit more clear for you. One of the most important schools is SSK, so this stands for Sociology of Scientific Knowledge. The first one who came up with this idea was the Edinburgh Strong program. Important names here are Barry Barnes and David Bloor, which will be coming back as Barnes and Bloor. And the reason it's called the Strong program is that it says that all knowledge is socially constructed. The way that they go about constructing their program is setting up 4 principles. These are about scientific beliefs. First one is causality, which looks at where do beliefs come from, what is the causal link between the outside world and beliefs that scientists have. Impartiality, which is where you don't look at whether a belief is true or not, to be impartial about the trueness of the beliefs. And that's because there's symmetry principle. The same cause can explain both true and false beliefs. So that goes both ways. And the most important one, to critics of the theory at least, is the reflexivity, which means that all of these principles also apply to SSK. The reason that they use principles instead of what later theorists use is to ensure objectivity in how you're going to study how scientific knowledge comes about. So there's a sub-program of SSK that I'm going to be talking about, which takes a little bit of a different approach. So this is called the laboratory studies approach, which instead of setting up principles, they use anthropological study of scientists. So they look at how do scientists interact with each other, what is their culture, etc. They use anthropology. In the next part of the book, instead of using sociology to look at how scientists interact and how scientific knowledge is formed, ES and ESK use economics. So they use things like individual incentives to see how do certain beliefs come about and how do they propagate, etc. First one of these is economics of science. This one is associated best with Robert K. Merton, which, if you Google his name, is very similar to Robert C. Merton, not the same guy. It's a sociologist, not the economist. He also sets up principles, except in this case they're scientific values. So in some sense this is also prescriptive. But the first one, universalism, it is kind of like impartiality. He says everyone faces the same criteria for their claims to truth. So it doesn't need to matter if you're like a very important scientist or if you're like an independent scientist, everyone faces the same criteria. Organized skepticism means that every idea, regardless of where they come from or how well supported they are, should be rigorously scrutinized by the scientific community. 3, disinterestedness. You should reward scientists for being selfless in their endeavors for truth. And 4th one is communalism, which in the book is also called communism. It means that scientific discoveries are under communal ownership. Now this one will be important because the reason that Merton and other supporters of this theory support subsidizing basic research by the government is that 3 and 4 mean that individual incentives for science is actually not very strong. For example, you don't get the rewards of your endeavors, don't go to just you, and everybody owns what you make, basically. Because of this, later on, ESK, which I didn't write that here, but the most important ones here are David and Dasgupta. It's very similar in that it uses economics to look at how scientific knowledge is propagated, but they focus way more on the economic incentives themselves. right? So they emphasize individual incentives rather than the broad principles. And the reason they do this is because they think that if you let science basically work like a market of ideas, you will get the same outcomes, but you won't have the problem of Merton where you have to subsidize research. One important player here, which is not quite the same, but very similar principles, is Philip Kitcher. And his important idea is that organization of science is the vision of cognitive labor, similar to how Adam Smith saw. All right, so quick recap of what we did. SSK and ESK are similar in that they are descriptive of how science comes about, but SSK uses anthropology, whereas ESK uses economics. Then within those, we also have two different kinds, Barnes and Bloor and Merton. So Barnes and Bloor for SSK and Merton for ES use principles, whereas Kitcher, which is for ESK, and David Dasgupta for SSK. Oh, oops, actually it's the other way around. So Kitcher is SSK, and David Dasgupta. They use broad concepts. So cognitive labor, that's Kitcher's idea. Open science are from David and Dasgupta. So finally, some general tips for studying the course. The differences between these are subtle, but they're also quite simple. So once you know them, it's very easy to spot them. And finally, it's, I think, quite important to make a lot of connections. So, for example, if you want to understand the difference between two, it's easy to see why they would think that way. So, for example, with David and Dasgupta, they sort of react to Merton and saying, okay, subsidizing research, that's kind of not a great idea. You could get, for example, bias from the government. We would rather have the open science model, in which we just use individual incentives, and that's supposed to produce good outcomes as well. All right, thank you for your attention. I hope you learned a little bit today. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to reach out, and I hope I can see you at the